Hi, everyone. I see people are still kind of rolling in, so I'm going to maybe wait a second. But welcome. Yeah, I guess might as well just get started here. Welcome, everyone, to this Montana Book Festival event in partnership with Fact and Fiction Books. The Montana Book Festival took place this year in September, and so all events that are happening after the festival, off-season, we've dubbed MBF Plus events, and I'm so thrilled this is our first event. So welcome, everyone, to our first MBF Plus event. My name is Lauren Korn. I'm the director of the Montana Book Festival. I'm really excited to welcome Anne Helen Petersen and Chris Latreille to our virtual space tonight. A few little notes before we get started. We'd like to welcome you as attendees and participants to enter your questions for Anne and Chris in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen. Here on the back end of things, we'll be monitoring those, and you can also feel free to talk amongst yourselves or chat amongst yourselves in the chat function as well. Like I said, we'll be monitoring those throughout the conversation. Chris and Anne might be answering your questions during the conversation, but we'll also leave time at the end of the conversation for audience questions. And with that, I'd like to introduce you to our featured authors tonight. Yep, there's Anne, and there's Chris. Hi to you both. I'm just gonna read your bios to introduce you. I hope that's okay. Chris Latreille, who resides near Missoula, Montana, is a writer of Chippewa Cree Métis descent and an enrolled member of the Little Shell tribe of Chippewa Indians. His first book, One Sentence Journal, Short Poems and Essays from the World at Large, won the 2018 Montana Book Award and a 2019 High Plains Book Award. His next book, Becoming Little Shell, will be published by Milkweed Editions in spring of 2021, although I think that may have changed, might be pushed back a little. And then Anne Helen Petersen is a former senior culture writer for BuzzFeed and now writes her newsletter, Culture Study, as a full-time venture on Substack. Petersen received her PhD at the University of Texas at Austin, where she focused on the history of celebrity gossip. Her previous books, Too Fat, Too Slutty, Too Loud, and Scandals of Classic Hollywood were featured in NPR, Elle, and The Atlantic. She lives in Missoula, Montana. Welcome, Anne and Chris. Take it away.
Thanks. Oh, now there goes Lauren. Annie, it's good to see you after like a year and a half of talking about getting together. This is the first time I've actually seen you moving around other than just text on a screen. So it's kind of a nice treat.
I know, right? Like instead of being in DMs on Twitter or in each other's inboxes, this is much nicer.
It is much nicer. Well, welcome. And I'm glad we're able to make this happen.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to go right into it.
Do it.
I used to think that a millennial was basically anyone younger than me that did things that I didn't approve of. So I've never really been able to grasp these designations around generations beyond the baby boomers. So is that when it started? Or like the baby boomers the first one who got their generation named? Because I don't even know. I think I'm Generation X.
Yeah, you're totally Generation X. And I could tell you that even if I don't know your precise age. Can you tell the audience a roundabout age, when you were born? When you were born?
I was born a year before to the day Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated.
Yeah, that's your
so that's a little thing. If people are like, when was that? You should know. That's the kind of talk we're going to have here.
No, you're Gen X. And, I think that, boomers were the first that they were given a name pretty early. Something like the greatest generation, as they're now known, which the parents of the boomers, they, you don't get that generation. They got that generation applied to them kind of retrospectively. And then people have also applied names to the lost generation, which is the generation kind of around World War I, and it refers to the fact that like a lot of the people of that generation were just lost actually to death during the war, and then also just a general kind of lost feeling after the shell shock and of the first mechanized war. But I think that we've become really obsessed with it now. Like that obsession has really accelerated during the post-war period. And, I don't think I even identified myself really as a millennial for a very long time, because everything that was said about millennials was bad. I didn't want to be associated with that. And I am also an elder millennial, so born in 1981. So I'm right on the cusp.
So millennials now are like 20s to early 30s, mid 30s?
Late 30s.
Late 30s?
So I'm 39.
Okay.
So millennials are turning 40 right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So still young by my standards, but not like when someone's pointing to some teenager on the street and complaining about millennials, they're totally off.
No. Like that's like kids these days, they're like, oh, these millennials, and they still think they're like, 19-year-olds, when that is firmly Gen Z. That is not even, the oldest Gen Zers. That is middle Gen Z.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I tell people though that being millennial can in this moment feel like a state of mind, because people have read the book who are older or who, whether they're boomers or they're Gen Xers, they're like, I really identify with a lot of this, especially.
Sure, absolutely. I did, for sure. And we didn't even mention, this is the book we're talking about, which you can get at Fact and Fiction Books. Got to throw that out there.
Yeah.
But why, that's a great point, because when I was reading that, I was thinking about my own experience with like my previous job and kind of how it's dovetailed into what I do now. And the notion of burnout, maybe take a couple minutes to describe exactly what we think of as just, I just can't even do it anymore, to steal your title. Because people like to come up with technical terms around what something means. Like, is there a technical term for burnout, or is it just like a state of mind or a sense that you have? I don't know.
So the technical definition, according to the World Health Organization, and this was actually developed after I wrote my essay that the book is based on. They did not do it because I wrote the essay. I think it just like became more.
Well, maybe they were one of the 8 million readers or whatever.
Yeah, but the World Health Organization defines it really as profound stress related to your occupational stress. And that to me, I think is a good expression of the fact that it's the World Health Organization that is making that call, not the American, not like the CDC, because the idea that you could somehow separate your occupational stress from the rest of your stress in our lives, right? In American lives, where so much of our lives just like work spills over into every corner of our lives and affects the precarity that we experience in all these different ways. Like it's impossible to disarticulate those two. And I think of it, instead of just like extreme occupational stress, I think of it as that exhaustion that is just your background, right? That no amount of sleep or even, like a 3-week vacation, it's not going to fix it. It is the feeling that you have been running for a really long time. You feel like you're going to drop any second. You hit the wall, then you scale the wall, and then you keep going some more. And then the other thing that I feel like it makes life feel as if it's a long list of to-dos, right? That like the list keeps recycling itself. It keeps overflowing, and none of those to-dos are that exciting, right? Things that should be fun and cathartic just feel like they're another thing that you need to get done off the list. And same for things that are you dread or you don't like to, all flattens.
And there's nobody watching this right now who's not nodding, no matter how old they are.
Right, exactly.
I mean, like so going back to that original essay that you mentioned that you wrote after you'd kind of been diagnosed by an editor as being burned out, and you're like, I'm not fucking burned out, right?
Yes.
First of all, what's it like to know that something you wrote was read by, what is it, like 5 million people. It's some ridiculous.
It's 8 million, it's between 7 and 8 million. And I think a lot of people click, that's clicks. That's like how many people clicked into it. But it does feel, it feels like I was able to articulate something that people have been feeling for a long time, right? So it's just, I didn't come up with the concept. It was a background feeling that people didn't have language to describe. And when so many people emailed me in response, the thing that they thanked me for was like, I can actually name this thing. I felt really alone. I thought this was a personal problem, which is a very American understanding of anything that we are experiencing, is that we are somehow as individuals failing.
Right.
And so that's the case, right?
That's like a state from being able to say, oh, I'm just really burned out, to I am suffering burnout. Capital B becomes an actual thing in our culture.
Yep.
So you write that essay and it goes viral, which is a word that's probably only been around for what, maybe a decade.
In terms of things that travel on the internet, yeah.
Right. And then you proceed to this. Was there some point in between where you had to overcome the burnout you were suffering that led to, or did you just keep going? Like, where are you at now?
No, I deal with it all the time. And, writing a book does not necessarily cure your burnout. No. As you know, it becomes a source of stress. Although I will say, like, the privilege of being able to take some book leave. So I was able to just stop working at my BuzzFeed job for 3 months and just concentrate on reading and researching the book over the course of the summer. Like, I could take some of the advance and use it to not have an income over the course of the summer. And that it did feel like I was able to really be doing one thing and to be free from some of those larger, frenetic multitasking, all of those sorts of things that are usually demanded of me. And I don't have kids. I have a partner who's pretty useful and who understands the writing life. He's also a journalist. And what I realized during that time is I was essentially being allowed to write like a man, right? Like, I was being able to have that writerly experience that is usually associated with wealthy male writers, right? Of isolation and concentration.
But there's, my experience was I came off a job that I'd worked for 13 years and to devote my time to writing. And I thought I was going to hit, because I'd already done some freelancing. I'd already been in some magazines, and I just thought I was going to hit the ground running. And I just shut down for half a year, to where it was almost a kind of like PTSD almost. Related to that, to where I just couldn't function. And I thought that I had it all together and knew exactly what I was going to do. And it just did not turn out that way at all. And I'm still kind of trying to get my legs back under me as a result of that, just as far as the focus and all of that, with all these things going on.
Right. Well, and it's one of those things where you were able to hold down a full-time job that had nothing to do with writing, that was asking you to travel all over the place, that was putting all of these stresses on you. And then you were writing on the side too, right? Which a lot of writers do, because it's the only way that they can make ends meet, is you have to wedge that writing into the side. But you were firing on all cylinders. Like, you were running so hard for so long that when you gave yourself even the slightest permission to stop running at that speed, your body took it, right? And was like, nope, we're done for now.
Yeah.
Like, it couldn't just slow down a gear. It needed to completely recover from the wear and tear that you had put on it for so long, psychologically and physically, probably. And I think that happens to so many people. But then you get frustrated because you're like, wait a second, I'm taking care of myself. I quit that job that was doing that to me. Why do I feel like a puddle on the ground?
Well, and what about like even your like the common perception of say what you do as a writer, who, you're working for BuzzFeed, you weren't going into an office, at least in the last few years since you've been in Missoula. And then you become a freelancer. Those aren't real jobs as far as people who don't really have never done it are concerned. You know what I mean? So I wonder how much of that, what we feel as burnout nowadays, with everybody just kind of cobbling together multiple jobs in order to make a living, to live anywhere. The perception of what is a real job with all of the gig economy type work that people are doing, where again, we're just kind of cobbling together our livings in a way that I was thinking about this, you know, when I was thinking about what we were going to talk about, like my dad who worked at the mill, which I can see, if I open my curtains, I can see the remains of it out my window. You know, he worked there for 43 years. And I can remember, you know, it was shift work. And for the longest time, it was day shift, swing shift, and graveyard. And then, you know, the last decade or more that he worked there, they switched to it was rotating 12-hour shift. And he used to complain about, oh, these goddamn 12-hour shifts. I can't get anything done before or after. But the way that worked out, he never worked, I think, more than 3 or 4 12s in a row. And every month, just the way the schedule worked, they had a week off or something. I mean, there was a lot of time off. And I think a lot of people, even watching this right now, are thinking 12 hours. I mean, that's like every day.
Every day.
7 days a week. I mean, I'm sure, you know, the way I cobble my living together, I'm working at night after putting in time at the bookstore. And, you know, my wife who runs a shop, she's taking orders over the phone and answering questions 24/7, you know, except for the 6 or 8 hours you might be able to sleep. I mean, do you think that perception of what is work, how much does that fuel just kind of the overwhelming anxiety that people feel related to this burnout phenomenon?
I mean, everything that you said is so spot on. Like I think of the old union rallying cry a lot of 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours to do what you will. You know, that was what union organizers were able to advocate for, what we came to know as the 40-hour work week. And if you work more than that, then you are paid significantly more, so much so more so that it disincentivizes employers from making you work overtime, right? Mm-hmm. And it formed this, like, there was just an interesting period of time in America with union forces and the way that the economy was in the post-war time, where it just like, you had this give and take that somehow managed to fall on less exploited workers who still managed to like have lives outside of their work, and also companies were healthy. And there's a lot of things that changed, and I think we still haven't arrived at a time where we've figured out how to like restabilize, right? Mm-hmm. So companies themselves have become very rigid and expected workers to become ever more flexible, and also internalize the idea that like, oh, if I get laid off, it's my fault, right? Like mm-hmm. all of these different, any sort of failure, if I don't get paid as much or benefits, like I should at least be grateful that I have a job. I think you feel a lot of that going on right now. And, you know, I think the contrast with a lot of our parents' and grandparents' generation, especially people who are doing physical work, shift work, hourly work, there's a tendency, I think, sometimes you want to fetishize it almost like, oh, I wish I still had like that sort of very regimented, I am on the job and then I'm off the job. And then people will say, well, you know, those people a lot of those people didn't really love their work and it was really hard on their bodies. I'm like, well, you know, what's hard on the body is working 8 hours of a retail shift and then driving Uber for 4 hours after that. Right. And then trying, you know, like, and then going home and doing all of the housework that's expected of you, especially if you're a woman and a mom. Like, those are body breaking activities too, just not necessarily in the traditional way that we think of someone who's working in a mill.
Well, I feel like everybody, you know how some countries have like required military service? I feel like in this country, we should have required either retail or food service so that everybody knows what it's like to work retail or work food service. And then maybe so many people wouldn't be such dicks to retail workers and food service workers.
Yeah, well, and I think there's a general, devaluing of that labor. You know, we talk about how these people who are working in the grocery store are essential workers, yet none of our behavior towards them, either like the corporate behavior towards these workers doesn't think of them as essential, and then our consumer behavior towards those workers doesn't think of them as essential. I think that the main way that we treat most workers up and down the pay scale, unless you're like in the very high echelons, is as completely disposable. And that that idea, that disposability, I think really relates precisely to like the precarity that gives burnout, that feeds burnout. It's all about that feeling of, I don't have any sort of stability. And that's also why burnout has ratcheted up during this time, because it's precariousness that people felt before the pandemic is just amplified physically, psychologically, economically.
Well, that's like the perfect segue for, like, you wrote this book, you were basically done right before the pandemic hit. And you wrote like in the introduction that think of all these issues, only more with COVID. So every little thing is amplified by this pandemic, but it also, everything is connected. So the pandemic shows how just terrible our health support system is. Not even so much, it used to be people who could say, well, in the United States, our healthcare is the best. It's our insurance system that's screwed up. Well, obviously now it's even the care that is a problem because they don't have the equipment and the tools they need to take care of us. So you've got your healthcare, you've got the fact that nobody has, you know, we pay all these taxes and it's like the only thing that they serve are things that if we don't pay them, the punitive pressure comes back at us more than any benefit we're gaining from paying them in the first place, whether it's safety nets so that we can take 4 months off to just shut down and everybody's going to get by and we're going to end this problem. So there's that safety net there. I mean, it's just like this glaring spotlight on how everything is messed up and everything. So the question is, Annie, how do we solve it? All on you. You wrote the book on burnout.
I do think my generalized answer, and I find this like whenever I'm writing a freelance piece where people want me to conclude on some like, how do we fix it? And I'm like, we care about other people, right? You authentically care about other people, and you show that care for other people by funding programs that care for everyone, that don't just care for people who are like you or in your immediate family or look like you or work the same jobs as you. Like, it has to extend that way. We also just care for people by doing things that benefit the collective good. And I think that's really hard to understand right now, because when people are precarious, it turns them inward. It makes you want to focus only on keeping yourself and maybe your family above water. And it makes people selfish, I think, and it makes people angry, and it'll inclines them. And I don't excuse this inclination by any means, but it makes it easier for them to choose responses that really feed on like their worst, most suspicious, most racist, most classist selves. And, you know, I just... being in Montana right now, like I think about my daily stress looking at the case numbers. Like, that is, of all things, I am so lucky that my job allows me to just stay home, right? To just stay put and to not have to think about my health or exposing people who are high risk in my family every day. But even with that, every day I open up the freaking COVID dashboard and just stare at it.
10 o'clock.
Right? Just stare at it. And I'm like, what is happening? And I watch as different stories come in across the state of people who just, they're telling themselves stories about what they wish the situation was instead of what the reality of the situation is. And they're not thinking about other people. And that causes burnout in others, you know, that doesn't solve it.
What do you think the other side looks like? I mean, someone raised this question, and that's the thing, that's the elephant in the room, is what do we do? What can we do to change this? To how do you put it? Burn it all down or whatever. I mean, I come back to it as someone who I'm a socialist. I'm becoming more of an anarchist as the days pass, because it's so clearly that none of our institutions not only are positioned to help us, but don't really even seem to care. I mean, everything good that's happening in Missoula right now, our businesses taking it on themselves to say, look, shit is bad right now, and we need to shut down to be a positive part of our community. And none of that's all bottom up. Top down, they're just like, well, everybody's got to be on their best behavior, and that's just not going to get it done. So I just wonder, there was a point where I thought maybe when this comes out, people will understand how precarious this world that we have all participated in creating is, and maybe we'll be motivated to do something different moving forward. But then I see people saying, oh, I can't wait so I can get on a plane and fly to Austin and have Texas barbecue again. It's like, that's how it got here in the first place.
Well, I think that one of the first things that's necessary is just harnessing that anger. Because before the pandemic, I do think that there was a lot of people felt this anger and this precarity in their own lives, but then would look around and be like, well, I mean, the unemployment rate is low and the stock market is high. It doesn't matter that I can never afford to own stocks, but like, I guess I should feel okay. And somehow if I don't, there's something wrong with me. But I think that what the pandemic has done is made it incredibly abundantly clear just how many things are broken, right? That we are a nation in decline in this moment. And that feels very shitty in multiple ways. But it's the reality, it's the truth. And I think that right now, I know a lot of people are just kind of trying to hang on for another 2 weeks, because what's the extent of the imagination that you can possibly deal with when we're under this administration, right? Mm-hmm. There's just so little that seems possible under the current regime. And so if you can get to a different regime, maybe we can start imagining some of these different ways, radically different ways of caring for one another and caring for our society. And what I think has to happen, though, and I've talked about this a little bit in my newsletter in different places, is we have to embrace what historians call plastic hour, which is a time that you can have abundant change, not just incremental change, not just the Affordable Care Act, but Medicare for all, right? Like, mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of people who, in the past, I think in like the recent past have been like, well, we just have to be careful. Like, you can't ask too much. You don't want to alienate people. You have to have that willingness to imagine a world that could be incredibly different, right? So not just even mandatory maternity leave, universal maternity leave, but also universal childcare. Mm-hmm. That sounds like a pipe dream, but it shouldn't be. And other places it is not.
What about housing, which I feel like right now around Montana, is possibly, next to just the fact that people are dying and we're getting more and more cases than ever before, it's out of control. I mean, all these articles, whether it's for Valley County or Bozeman or Missoula, there's a young woman who's we follow each other on social media, who lives in Bozeman, talks about since they signed their lease in 2019, their apartment is like $400 a month higher, and we're reaching a point where the people who have to do all these jobs that have been proven to be the essential ones, the people working at the grocery store, and the people delivering groceries, and the people delivering food, and the people working drive-throughs, and all of these things that so many people have been leaning on, they're not going to be able to live here. Yep. And what then? Are they supposed to live in Condon and drive 2 hours to work for $9 an hour? I mean, if there was one thing that you could solve, which one would it be? What would you do first if you're put in charge?
Well, every place has its own thing that's the first foundational thing, right? The reading I've been doing for this new book that my partner Charlie and I are working on is about working from home and like what that could look like. But all the work I've been doing is just on the history of work and the history of the job. And the big thing that a lot of these histories point to is there was a shift that happened in the 80s, 90s, 2000s, where the hierarchy of needs, you know, like the old school hierarchy of needs, it's like the pyramid of like, oh, if you have this, then you can consider this and consider this. So it used to be, okay, if you have stability, then you can build all of these other things on top of it. So if you have stable housing, stable employment or source of income, and stable health for your family and yourself, then you can start doing things like being creative or innovating or helping others as well, right? But that stability is foundational. And happiness is the other thing. You can get to happiness if you have that stability and can build on it. And what happened over the course of the 80s, 90s, 2000s is that companies started saying, we want happy workers who are flexible. And if you can come to us as happy workers who are, you're like, okay, so no minimum wage increase, no affordable housing in your area, no healthcare, no benefits. You only know your schedule a week ahead of time and it's created by an algorithm. But if you're happy with that, then and take this job, then maybe you can get at stability. It's an inverted pyramid. And of course, when you think of an inverted pyramid, it's not stable. It's always going to topple. And so I think the thing that's missing specifically in a lot of places in Montana and in Missoula in particular is that affordable housing piece of the puzzle or foundation of the pyramid. And, you know, I know this is like all of Montana, but Missoula in particular likes to talk crap about Big Sky and about the sort of people who live in Big Sky and like the sort of environment that has been cultivated there. We're going to create that again, right? Like that is what Missoula is going to be. It's going to be a place where the people who are providing those fundamental services have to be bussed in because there is no housing for them that is available in town. And so if you can't control the market, right? And we like, what can you do? Be like, no houses can be sold over $450,000 in Missoula. You can't do that because we live in a capitalist country. So what can you do? You need to create more supply. You just have to. And I think
or you smash capitalism. I'm for the smashing capitalism. Seriously. I feel like we need to address that in a meaningful way, because this runaway funnel into this huge hopper that funnels all of our work, all of our effort, and all that money goes into this tiny little spout into just a handful of pockets.
Yeah.
And people think, oh yeah, let's smash capitalism. No, I'm serious. Let's do it and create something different. I don't see. It's like I saw this comedian one time talking about spoiled milk, taking it out of the refrigerator and smelling it. Oh, that's bad. Well, putting it back, maybe it'll be better tomorrow. It's never worked.
Right.
I mean, that's how I feel. And it's like, how do we smash it, or how do we invert it, or how do we do something different without, putting us fighting each other with guns and clubs in the street first?
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, because my politics also gravitate that way, if not fully embrace. And then I go out and I report in places like Montana and Idaho and places like where I grew up in Lewiston. And like, there are people who have just really internalized the ethics and the necessity of capitalism, that they will come out with guns if you try to change that. Right? And they really also, I think that they see it as a way of distributing what is rightfully theirs instead of thinking in a collectivist manner. And that's hard to overcome. And to me, it also speaks to this idea that like we are so obsessed with like, oh, the way things are, the way they just have to be this way. None of this is predetermined, right? We have made all sorts of decisions that have made it this way. People call millennials the unluckiest generation, as if it was luck that caused the Great Recession, right? Like as if like, oh, it just so happened that there was this massive global recession. Those were choices that were made. Or, even just the people make fun of the antagonism between millennials and boomers. And a lot of it has to do with choices that were made by people on both sides of the political spectrum over the course of the 80s and the 90s to disassemble the safety net. There's a lot of resentment there that the things that boomers had in terms of stability, especially white boomers, that those things have unraveled. Of course, that other generation is going to be like, how dare you call us lazy?
Right.
know?
Well, and we have faced these huge systems before that we thought, well, that's just the way it is. I mean, slavery. There were people that were just as adamant about coming out guns blazing to take their slaves away, and we fought a war over it. The right for the various people to vote, most recently women, that was something that was just never going to happen. And we changed that. So I think that's the argument you make with whoever that, and the hard part is to not, and this is my problem, is not getting all worked up and being an asshole about it. As soon as you start calling people names, and both sides do it,
yes,
then the conversation stops. But there are people that if you go to them and you explain, well, here's this system that you think is so important, this is what it's doing to you. Mm-hmm. And I'm one of you, I don't know. It's a conversation that I feel like needs to be more seriously engaged with, but unfortunately all the routes where that conversation can be most heard are controlled by people who have a vested interest in not having the conversation.
Well, and right? I think that a place like Montana is a place where you can have these conversations.
Yeah.
To some extent, right? I think that the smaller your community, the more capabilities you have to actually connect with someone and have a conversation that you're talking about ideological issues, but you can relate to them in a personal way. You can be like, listen, here is how I have experienced this on a personal level. And that is oftentimes how people's minds are persuaded. For better or for worse, we are oftentimes persuaded by personal stories in a way that we are not persuaded by the stories of systems.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know, the beginning of the book, a lot of it is about how I moved to Montana. So this was right after the presidential election, because I'd come to Montana to cover the Gianforte special election. And I had been driving all around and just was like, oh, I'm so happy. Like, this is my landscape. This is, I could talk to people, like it just great. And moved out here and then just found myself working all the time.
Yeah.
And I remember a friend of mine who had quit journalism because it had gotten to everything all the time. But he was like, no one moves to Missoula to work. And I think to work as in as in to work all the time, to choose to work. You're not working. You're not like, hey, you know what I want to do when I get into Montana? I want to work the same hours I did when I lived in New York.
Right. Exactly.
And that's what I was doing. I was like, oh, I don't have to be on the train anymore. I can just work more.
Right. So you just made a big personal change as far as leaving your BuzzFeed gig to go all in on the newsletter and all of that. How terrifying is that? And what's your burnout? Because I hear from you more now through your newsletter, it seems like you're working more than ever. And I don't know, because I don't see what's going on behind the scenes. I know what it takes to do a big story, but never seeing that, you don't see how much work is happening. So I wonder that, because I have so many friends who are creative types that are trying to monetize every little possible thing to try and figure out a way to make a living as an artist. Yeah.
I mean, the hard thing is that the option that was available to me is not an option that is available to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
I had enough of a following that I had cultivated. I don't want to discredit myself here. I had cultivated this following very purposefully. I know how you feel about Facebook, but I started a Facebook page back in 2008 when I was writing a crappy WordPress blog. I was writing a crappy WordPress blog called Celebrity Gossip Academic Style. I started it while I was getting my PhD as an outlet just to talk about the things that I was studying, but in a non-academic way. And I cultivated that space and grew it. So it's like 40,000 members, but you know how Facebook is, like, you know, only a very small portion of those members actually see it on any regular basis. But I had that. And then I also grew my Twitter following, and like through being in a place that has as much exposure as BuzzFeed, I was exposed to other people and writing books and that sort of thing. And so I was confident at the time when I switched over that I would be able to make enough money to keep me afloat just doing the newsletter. And I was just so tired of the whims of digital media, like always being scared that we're starting a new, like every year there was a new form of layoffs. And is it coming for BuzzFeed? Are we staving them off this year? And the pandemic came, and we all took pay cuts, and a lot of people took furloughs, and we took additional pay cuts in order to prevent more people from taking furloughs. And that was the power of a union. But I was just, and a lot of this has to do with all of the precarity that I experienced when I was an academic. I was just sick of it. I had spent my entire adult life being in this incredible precarious position. And even though there is still an amount of precarity in doing the freelance life, I am at a position of relative stability that it felt more stable. So I'm doing about the same amount of work, you know, working on this new book. Right before this, I was reading this great book, such an academic cover, Works Intimacy by Melissa Gregg. She lives in Portland, but I'm reading all of this research for the new book. And then I kind of cull from that to work on, to write the newsletter and to think about these larger subjects that don't necessarily have a home in traditional media. You know, a lot of the things that I write about, it's hard to think of a pithy Facebook viral title for them. You know, I was sick of writing a story that's just like, why blank matters, because that's a thing that does well on Facebook and travels over the internet. I wanted to get into the little corners and the nitty gritty. And I am grateful that there are people who support me in doing that. But it's also still scary, right? Because Substack is still, it's venture capital funded too, you know?
Right. Well, and I think about that, like when you said about trying to find the story, you know, I mean, I tell people that my 3-day-a-week gig at the bookstore is my freelance career, because I make about what I would be able to count on making, probably writing freelance articles, but I don't have to try and convince any. All I have to do is show up and do my job, and I can write whatever I want to do on my newsletter or whatever. And that's all of my book research material, since we're showing book covers, you know. But I will say to people, you know, one of the things I talk about a lot is literary citizenship and being there in support of people around you. And for people who are participating in this, Anne Helen Petersen, her literary citizenship or digital citizenship or whatever, you have been very kind to me. And whenever you draw attention to anything I write, I know immediately, because my inbox just blows up. So I appreciate that. And that's important, because it's a tiny world. And I get asked that question from, you know, people, what do you say to young writers, or what do you say to students or whatever? Say, do not be an asshole to people, because you will encounter them again if you stick with this, because it's a tiny world.
Well, and I think, I mean, there is a real tendency for people to reproduce the same sort of writing that they're doing in the world, right? Like or the same type of people rise to prominence over and over again. And a lot of those people have the same perspectives, and they look the same, and they come from the same places. And I was reared on Pacific Northwest and Montana voices. Like, these are the voices that are essential to me. And it always makes me sad when, like, people that I assume everyone has read, that they're somehow like thought of as regional writers, right?
Yeah.
Or Montana writers. And I'm like, no, that is just a writer. Like, that is essential reading. Or, I mean, this is kind of off topic, but when I lived in New York, I used to try to use sometimes like the phrase Mountain West, right, to describe where we live. And I had a couple editors who would be like, what is this? This isn't a phrase that people use. I'm going to be like, it's a fucking time zone. Are you kidding me? Of course
Right.
it's a region.
Right.
So I feel really, I feel like it's just part of the cycle of authorship and of friendship and collaboration, is that if there are people who are doing work that I read and that inspires me and that feels important to me and vital, I want more people who aren't in Montana or who are in Montana to have access to that, which is why I goaded you into doing the newsletter.
You did goad me. It's worked out. I like it. Except for the days when I feel like I should write something and I don't know. I don't want to be negative all the time. It's hard. I mean, how do you? I mean, we see a lot of the same stuff on Twitter, but you see like 10 times, like your question yesterday, how would you define neoliberalism? And then like 2 hours later, you're like, I'm muting this because I had no idea it was going to be a shit show.
Well, I did have an idea it would turn into a shit show. It's just, I think what happened, and this is what always happens, is that like some libertarian retweeted it. And then you have a lot of people who have a different understanding of what neoliberalism means to them. But I think there's always that bit of fun and frisson before it turns dark.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually think that Montana Twitter is really pretty wonderful.
Yeah.
I have like a column in my TweetDeck. TweetDeck is something that people who are on Twitter too much use to kind of organize their Twitter experience. And so I have a list of just Mountain West, and it's people from all over the place. Most of the from different perspectives. Most of them are just kind of normal people. Some of them are journalists. Some of them are thinkers, whatever. And Montana is still small enough that it feels like there is a cohesive Twitter presence on there.
You kind of have to mute or block everybody from Ravalli County, though, don't you? That's my perception anyway. How do you, though? How do you, I mean, you have to have boundaries around your time.
Oh, I'm bad at it.
To not just, because that's my problem, like with COVID. It's like if my rage level is typically here.
Yeah.
Normal times, I'm kind of floating around here because I'm pretty easygoing generally, and every now and then I'd spike up above there and I'd be mad for a couple hours and it'd go away. But now I feel like my good mood is right here, and it just takes a speed bump to just like make me outraged for hours at a time.
Yep.
How do you manage that? Somebody asked if in the Q&A if writing Can't Even was cathartic or not.
Yeah, it was cathartic. And for me, writing is a catharsis. That is the way that I work through ideas. My partner teases me sometimes that like, I'll be upset about something and can't really articulate why I'm upset, but he can kind of sense that I'm upset. And then I'll sit down and I'll write a newsletter, and then it'll show up in his inbox. And he's like, oh, I get it. Mm-hmm. That I have to, and that's always been my personality style. When I was a kid, I used to go to camp all the time, and I'd get a lot of pen pals. And then as I got older, even in high school and in college, I wrote letters all the time. And that was the way I think I learned to process emotions and ideas. And so editing is the hard thing for me. Like that is how writers always talk about the thing that's painful, and the writing is never the painful thing. The writing is the thing that feels like release. But it's that hard, that slippage between things that are pleasurable and things that are work, things that are hobbies and things that are side hustles. At what point, if I'm doing all of these things and they're all part of this larger, like nebulous understanding of who I am, what's work, what's not, what's me, what's not. Like there are benefits to being integrated in that way, but there are a lot of difficulties in making time that isn't available for other people's monetization and consumption.
My problem, like with the book I'm working on, is I'm so hyper aware of certain things. So like my big thing is the treatment of Indigenous people in North America. And with that in my head all the time, it's like I'm seeing modern versions of it everywhere. And there was even one instance that came out in your book that, what the hell? What is wrong with population decline?
Right.
So just because I have a feeling about that, or there was a trigger that snapped in the way I'm viewing the world these days, because people care about that. Like in Japan, it needs what 2 point whatever, what per family or whatever to maintain, let alone grow the population. And it's like at 1 point something, or your statistics. Why should we care about that? And why do people get so upset about that?
Right. Well, and I mean, I'm not upset about it, right?
Right.
Like it is something though that somehow appeals to people who can't otherwise be convinced that something's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That like because I do think there are some fundamental problems. Like if you are not reproducing, like if people aren't having families, and the reasoning that they're not having families is because the way our society is set up makes it really, really, really,
Mm-hmm.
really difficult, then that should tell us something. But I think you're totally right that like what's wrong with there not being as many people?
Right.
Is that actually a problem?
Right. The tactic I was going to take with that is like, if I was going to write a newsletter about that, is people get upset that if we don't maintain this certain level of population, we are going to lose our culture, or we're going to lose our country, or whatever the reason is that they're going to be. And I flip that to what happens on Indian reservations in this whole blood quantum thing.
Yep.
Which is literally the long game to eliminate people by making it less and less possible to be enrolled in a tribe, and that over a certain amount of time, the tribe doesn't exist because no one any longer qualifies by this bullshit blood quantum to be a member of the tribe.
Yep.
And so that's one of those kind of cultural things where on this hand, the same people saying, oh, it has to be this way, but well, no, that has to be that way. That's just the way, you know what I mean? So I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't
no,
know how
totally.
I got on that tangent.
No,
I'm always looking for an excuse to rant about Indians getting screwed.
No, and I think that though is it's an example of how like these ideas of science that we're always like, oh, science is always a great idea, right? Until it turns into race science and like science that produces these colonial understandings like blood quantum that actually like can lead to the actual erasure instead of just the cultural erasure of an entire people. By the way, I just want to pitch Taylor Irvine's work on blood quantum that is recently published in, what is it, National Geographic?
It was,
I'm going to put it in the chat eventually, but like that to me, she was just an incredible manifestation, like visualization of the actual choices that have to be made in order to preserve blood quantum in any sort of capacity. Should we look to see if it's 5?
We should, yeah. Because I know everybody needs to go watch the debate for some reason.
Oh my gosh, what a thing that's totally not going to burn me out more is watching the debate. I like this one. As an undergrad, I got to the point where I was resenting the time it took to walk to class because I could be working on schoolwork. I made a very conscious decision to not be that way in grad school. Being in Missoula, a community of other folks who also valued not working all the time helped. So I totally get this. And like part of the book, or part of what sparked the book, was me thinking about errand paralysis. And I was trying to figure out why I couldn't get my errands done. And I think one of the things that I decided was that I arrived at was that I resented anything that took me away from my capacity to work all the time. So one of the things I struggled with is I have this beautiful pair of boots, and I needed to take them to the cranky cobbler that's like down. Shakespeare and Co. Yeah. And he's so cranky, and you never know when he's going to be there. And he tells you a week, and you come back and he says 2 more weeks. He did amazing work on my boots, but I was like, oh, well, I don't know if there's going to be parking on the hip strip. It's a 5-minute drive, but I resented that it would take me those 5 minutes to go down. Right. But I also found in Missoula a great thing is that, when I would be waiting for the train when I lived in New York, or going to the bodega and waiting in line to check out with my very expensive groceries, every single person on their phone, right? And walking down the street, every person on their phone. And I'm not trying to like idealize Montana or Missoula. I know that some people still do that, but I find it is far less normalized to be on your phone at all times in all scenarios. And even just having that slight cultural shift, it's just liberating. Because when other people are on their phones around you, you're like, oh, well, I guess I should be on my phone, right?
Right.
Even when it's something that's not, you don't want to be there. You don't want to be making that choice. But sometimes our most tired selves resort to those sorts of situations that we don't want to actually embrace.
So what do you actually do in Missoula? Because you, for being this big time national, international book cover on the side of a building in New York writer, you fly pretty low under the radar.
I mean, this is the
problem.
problem.
By choice?
I'm an introvert. And so part of that, I get nervous about like social situations, and I'm like, oh, like I just feel like the kid that I always was, who was hiding behind my mom's legs when they try to introduce me to other people, or like my junior high self, who was just like always so like embarrassed and nervous, and just like wanted to wear my no fear shirt. Like it was the only thing that made me feel confident going to my junior high, was having a no fear shirt.
Right.
So that's part of it, honestly. And then the other part is that, especially pre-COVID, I was traveling all the time. And I think one of the nice revelations of the pandemic is realizing some of the habits and strategies that I had that were not serving me, and that were actually like not allowing me to engage in place. Like I knew the rhythms of the Missoula airport better than I knew something down.
And the TSA agents probably.
Yeah, all of them very friendly, because I was a white woman who had like a small bag and knew what I was doing and was in the TSA pre-check line. All that seems very, very far away and very unimportant in this moment. But being at home has allowed me to, like over the course of the summer and stuff, to people who were neighbors that I was just passing, hi friends with, like you actually get in long conversations with them. The pace of life has slowed down. And I hope that there are some components of that we can keep with us, even as we, in 7 years, go back to life as usual.
Anybody else have any questions before we wrap this up?
Well, I just want to thank you so much, because you have, I love when you push me. I love when you get cranky. If anyone is not subscribed to Chris's newsletter, it gives me a moment of Montana that I always don't realize that I'm missing until it's there. Like the last newsletter, which was about basically like cutting logs up in the Swamp Valley. And it made me feel that experience so vividly. And I'm really grateful for you. And I'm really grateful for the Montana Book Festival, which I think puts on some of the best events. And one of my favorite things, actually made some connections with people who I am good friends with all across Montana now from my experience last year. So.
Well, thank you for all that. Yeah, I appreciate that. Anybody else before I start crying?
I'm just going to jump in and save you, Chris, if that's okay.
Thank you, Lauren.
Yeah, this was such a wonderful conversation, and it went in so many different directions. Thank you both, Anne and Chris, for being here with us today. I popped both your newsletter subscriptions in the chat and your books, links to your books at Fact and Fiction. Congratulations, Anne, on Can't Even. Thank you, everyone watching and participating. It was a very lively conversation in the chat today, too. Just as a reminder, you can purchase Can't Even on Fact and Fiction's website, factandfictionbooks.com. And I also urge you, from my role as the director of the Montana Book Festival, to donate to us so that we can continue MBF Plus events like this one, and like next week's conversation with Emily and Danforth and Carrie Shipers. Yeah, I think this was amazing. Thank you for kind of kicking off our MBF Plus events. And so, and thank you, audience. Good night.
Thanks.
Right.